Welcome in, everybody, to the Flagship Podcast. I am Chip Brown of Horns247.com, joined by the man in Tuscaloosa, covering the Alabama Crimson Tide, John Talty, Bama247.com. John, it's finally here. Texas, Alabama, future Southeastern Conference mates, but for this weekend, a chance for one of these teams to prove to themselves that that they might be a team to be reckoned with for the season. I mean, Bama is every year. My God, what? Last year, Alabama had 2 losses for the first time since 2010. Is that right?
Yeah, during the regular season. Yeah.
I mean, Texas fans would do anything for that. And it just seems like, since the national championship game in the 2009 season, everything has gone to the moon for Alabama, and Texas has been out in the desert wandering around. So size it up from your perspective. Texas is coming to Tuscaloosa. What is the level of excitement in Tuscaloosa for this game? And obviously, Bama coming off an impressive 56-7 win over Middle Tennessee in their season opener.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the game of the week. I think, you're going to have college game day in town, 6 o'clock game. Yeah, I'm sure lots of Texas fans will be there. You're going to have a lot of Alabama fans there. I think the tailgating scene is going to be rocking. And I think it's the game that all offseason people were talking about. And I think it's in part because with all of the quarterback questions, they've got to have it figured out by the Texas game. And so I think that was a lot of the attention this offseason. Like, this is such a huge game, not fully make or break, but if you lose this game, it certainly makes it kind of a tight wire act the rest of the season, given the SEC opponents they're going to have to play. So there's a lot at stake, and there's a lot of connections and overlap, between these two programs, between all of the guys now at Texas who previously were at Alabama. You've got Jalen Miller, who's a Texas kid, one-time Texas commit, who's the likely starter after winning week 1. So there's just a lot of interesting kind of storylines around this game beyond just the fact that it's a really important game for both of these programs.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with Jalen Miller, because that was, there was a lot of intrigue or interest when Saban didn't release a game 1 depth chart for the first time in 17 years. And he wasn't talking about who his quarterback was going to be. And of course, it turns out it was indeed Jalen Miller, as you said, a former commit to the University of Texas. And wow, I mean, he put on a show. Talk about his performance in that win over Middle Tennessee.
Yeah, I mean, I think he, did what you were looking for in that game. He's the first Alabama quarterback to have 3 passing touchdowns and 2 rushing touchdowns in one game. Made no major mistakes, no turnovers. I think one of the big question marks heading into this season with Jalen was, whether he could hit the deep ball, and he had struggled in his limited opportunities previously. And you had 2 touchdowns for longer than 40 yards, had another touchdown for a little less than 30. So he was able to do some things like that. You made some great plays with his legs. We kind of knew he was able to do that. We knew he was super athletic, and him able to scoop up a botch snap and return it for a touchdown. It kind of speaks to the magical abilities he has at times. But there's still some nitpicky stuff. And I think there's, I assume for you too, if Texas against, Rice, like, you got to take some of it with a grain of salt. How much can we really infer from what they're able to do against Middle Tennessee State versus what they're going to do against Texas? But big picture wise, he did what he had to do to be the guy moving into week 2 against Texas.
Yeah, I mean, talk about how he's carried himself through camp and how he's evolved as a player, a leader from the limited action that we saw from him last year.
Yeah, I think he's grown a lot. Again, I think last year we saw him, Texas A&M, Arkansas, the 2 big ones, and it wasn't great as a passer, was super athletic, against Arkansas in particular. I mean, just was doing a lot on the ground. And so you knew at a minimum this guy's going to be effective in that way. But I don't know if we knew what his full passing capabilities were. But I think we saw some of that on display against Middle Tennessee State. And as a leader, I think he's grown a lot. Talking to Seth McLaughlin, their starting center, last night, it's a cliche, but he's like, he truly is like the first guy in. Like, when I get in there, his car is there and Nick Saban's car are there, so he's one of those guys who's really tried to put in the extra effort, worked with, throwing of receivers and stuff in the offseason. I think he was the kind of the popular pick in that locker room, which does factor when the race is close. And I think he is their highest floor option. And I think that's in part why he started against Middle Tennessee State. And I think, why he's going to start against Texas is that I think Saban's able to trust him the most out of the main options they have.
Yeah. And he adds a different element to the Alabama offense than what we've seen under Bryce Young, under Mac Jones, under Tua Tagovailoa. And so, everyone sort of suspected that bringing in Tommy Rees, that this Alabama offense was going to kind of go back to the offense that smash-mouthed Texas in that 2009 national championship game with Mark Ingram and Hightower. And so talk about the identity of this Alabama offense and maybe how it's changing.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk of that in the offseason. I think it's been a big priority for especially the offensive line, talking about wanting to be more physical and wanting to, really physically overpower these other programs. I think if there was one of the nitpicky type things coming out of that Alabama Middle Tennessee State game is that I don't feel like they really did that. I mean, they were good from a pass protection standpoint, but the smash mouth, we're going to run it down your throat. I mean, they were not able to do that against Middle Tennessee State. And so I'm curious to see how that translates in a Texas game where they're going to have an even better front seven. There's something to be said of you getting up for a better opponent. But for all of the offseason hype and the talk of, they've got 3 offensive linemen on their starting line who weigh more than 350 pounds, like you're looking to see them really push around some guys. And I didn't really see that against Middle Tennessee State, but saw more 12 personnel yesterday. Nick Saban talked about how it's probably the best tight end group they've had in terms of both guys who can actually block and then also, guys who can make an impact in the passing game. Amari Niblack is a guy who's been effective, had a good fall camp, had a touchdown last night. So I think they're trying to be more of that, which is what we expected of Tommy Rees. But I don't know if it's after one game, I don't think all the pieces are fully formed yet.
Yeah, I think Texas and Alabama sort of share that distinction coming out of their season opener, because Texas wasn't pushing anyone around in the first half. They kind of got it going in the passing game in the third quarter when they scored on 3 series and kind of broke that game open against Rice. But the running game was spotty. The blocking up front was spotty. So a lot of game 1 to game 2 improvement needed. Maybe, well, certainly from the Texas standpoint, but
no, it seemed very similar to Alabama, and you wonder sometimes too is how much of it is it keeping it a little vanilla against a Rice, a Middle Tennessee State. I mean, I have no doubt Sark's going to have some interesting stuff in the bag he's going to pull out against Alabama. So you wonder if that's a little bit of the kind of game within the game that neither one of them wants to show everything they have. But Bama's offense definitely lulled for periods, and then kind of end of the second quarter, beginning of the third quarter, they broke it open, had 3 passing touchdowns, and then that was kind of the end of Jalen Miller's day, and they were able to kind of just ride it out from there. But for all of the talk of how they're so spoiled with the running backs and offensive line, it wasn't a great day from my opinion.
Well, let's talk about Alabama's cast of running backs. Jace McClellan, Roydell Williams, Richard Young, Justice Haynes, Jamarian Miller. They all got in the game. What stood out? Who stood out in that group?
I don't know if there was one guy who really blew anybody away. I think there was some issues with pass blocking at the running back position. There was a couple plays where either Miller got sacked or got pressured, and it was just the running back not picking up the blitzer well enough. So I think that's something they're going to have to work out. To me, it feels like, and I was talking to somebody after the game about this last night, that it's a really good stable of running backs, but there's not that one guy that you feel like is the horse that you can just ride. You know, you think about some of the great Alabama running backs that they've had. Derrick Henry, you know, was who won the Heisman in 2015, but TJ Yeldon, you mentioned Mark Ingram and all these guys. Like, there doesn't feel like a definitive talent like that on this team. I'm very high on Justice Haynes, who is one of the top running back recruits in the country coming out of Buford in Georgia, but he's a freshman. And so, like, to me, 2 years from now, he might be that guy, but I don't know that Jace or Jam Miller or, Justice, any of those guys is at that point right now. I feel like they're all solid. They're all good. Plenty of, again, we're talking about first world problems here. There are lots of programs in the country who would love all of those guys, but just because of how spoiled Alabama has been, I don't know if any of those guys really rise to that level, at least from what we've seen.
Well, Jalen Milroe's ability to run presents problems. I think back to Texas's game at Arkansas 2 years ago, and, KJ Jefferson ran 10 times for like 73 yards, but it killed Texas. He extended drives. He just kept them off balance. Arkansas ended up running for 333 yards in that game. And so maybe the complement of Jalen Milroe with these running backs, it adds that element. But I do think that is kind of the marquee matchup. The Alabama offense, Jalen Milroe, these running backs, this offensive line against the Texas defensive line, the Texas defensive front. What do you think about that? And what stands out to you about this matchup?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely one of the big ones. I mean, I think there's a couple. I'll start with that one. I think it's one of the big questions for this Alabama team heading into the season. If you go back to last year's Texas game, I think it was a major problem in that game, is just the wide receivers' inability to get separation and be able to make plays. I think it was a problem for them last year. They had brought in multiple guys from the transfer portal, and just none of them really panned out the way they thought they would. And I think that put a lot of pressure on Bryce Young to make something out of nothing. Now, the great thing about Jalen Miller is that I think he can do that too, in a different way. I mean, he's just so athletic, and he's able to do things with his legs that if there's nothing there, I think he can really hurt you. But if you can't keep a team honest with your passing ability because nobody can get open, then you're just going to see them load up the box more and more, and that makes it even more challenging. So I'm curious to see, who they can get open. They were playing Middle Tennessee State. So yeah, guys got open last night, and that was great. But how many of those guys are able to do that against what I think is a pretty good Texas secondary? That to me is a real question. And on the flip side, Alabama's defense looked really good last night, but two of their guys in the secondary who were starters both got banged up on special teams plays and did not return for the rest of the game. Now, Jalen Key, who's a UAB transfer, seemed to be moving around pretty well. I was watching him on the sidelines. Seems to be okay. He's getting tested today. And Malachi Moore looked a little more banged up. Some buzz, might be an ankle sprain. But if those two guys are limited or they're not able to play at all, I mean, that's a real blow. And I'd worry about how those backups step in and whether Texas can really exploit that.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because Quinn Ewers, kind of a slow, sluggish start. Like I said, got into a rhythm in that third quarter when he was able to throw for, and he ran for a touchdown in garbage time, but was able to throw for 3 touchdowns in that game. We think back. Let's grab a quick break here on the Flagship Podcast, talking to John Talty of Bama247.com. We'll be right back. And if you're watching us on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel, we'll roll on here. But John, one of the weird elements to Texas, Alabama, the last 2 meetings is Texas's quarterback has been knocked out of the game early. Colt McCoy, of course. How many times have Alabama fans heard, if only Colt McCoy stayed healthy? And then last year, Ewers gets planted on his shoulder by Dallas Turner, and it's lights out for Quinn Ewers in the late in the first quarter. this, that's a really quirky element to this series here recently. Texas needs to put their quarterbacks in bubble wrap, I guess, in this game. But your thoughts on, Quinn Ewers and what you saw last year in the game in Austin?
Yeah, I mean, I thought he looked really good. I mean, it's especially given what we ended up learning about that Alabama team. I don't want to fall into the same thing, but I mean, I do. It does. There's a very real argument I think you can make that if he wasn't hurt, that Texas would have won that game. We saw Alabama struggled on the road all season last year, and they struggled on the road, and that was one of those. It's one of those games that I remember writing about at the time. It was like either this is a real issue or it's like a early big game jitters and they'll figure it out. And they never figured it out. And every road game they had past that, they did not look great and they just couldn't figure it out. And so I think there's a real argument that they would have lost that game if he didn't get hurt. I mean, he was lighting them up. And I mean, it took some Bryce Young heroics at the end of that game to win. So take Bryce Young out of it, but then you move the game to Alabama where they've played significantly better. And for whatever reason, I mean, they just couldn't figure it out on the road last year, and they were very good at home. So that's, an advantage, I think, for Alabama in this round. But I was very impressed by what I saw from him last year. The fact that you had probably the most hyped quarterback prospect in decades maybe, in Arch Manning. And, you could just see, a lesser guy, you could crumble under the pressure of something like that. And the fact that there wasn't really a major question, seemed like he won that competition pretty, substantially. I think that says a lot about him. And I'm excited to see what he can do. I mean, I think it's going to be a really fascinating game. And I think has the potential to really make a statement on a national level if he's able to beat Alabama next week.
Yeah, it's another quirky element to this series is that Texas leads the series 7-2-1. The two losses, of course, were the 2009 national championship game. And then last year, most of Texas's wins happened before the television was invented. But you've got this 21 game home winning streak for Alabama. And you just mentioned it. Tuscaloosa, the atmosphere, Nick Saban thanking the fans and the great atmosphere in the win over Middle Tennessee. What's in store for the Longhorns when they hit Tuscaloosa?
Yeah, I think it's going to be rocking. I really do. I think at times, I think that fan base has been a little spoiled just because of how good they've been. And, sometimes there's I was at the Alabama-Tennessee game last year, and that crowd was one of the best I've ever experienced. And it was in part just because Tennessee had been bad for so long, and them finally beating Alabama, it was this jubilation, And so, but I think in part because of the year they had last year and the fact that, night game, people have all day to hang out and drink and be ready for it. It's a big game. Texas is a big name opponent. Again, I think Texas fans will show up. I think it's going to be an extremely lively crowd. I think people will be very fired up for this one. And it's the game that they've been thinking about all summer. So I think you'll see one of the better Alabama crowds after there being some issues. And the good thing too, again, about a night game is that you avoid some of the heat issues that have been a problem, the last, couple of years for Alabama. They have these early 11 a.m. I know Texas deals with this too. You have some of these 11 a.m. September games and it's more than 100 degrees and people just are passing out and don't want to be there, So I think that affects the crowd sometimes too, where you're like, I don't want to be at a game like that. Whereas this one, it'll, be probably 75, 80 degrees by 6 o'clock and it'll be okay.
Yeah. Well, the line opened, I think it was 6.5. It went to 7 pretty quickly after this Rice game. And it's 7.5 in some places. So I think Alabama won the first impression test with their opener over Middle Tennessee as opposed to Texas's game against Rice. But, you mentioned it earlier. You've got this familiarity. Steve Sarkisian, Jeff Banks, A.J. Milwee, Kyle Flood, they were all at Alabama. They practiced against Nick Saban's defense every day for 2 years. Well, and even longer if you go back to when Sarkisian was an analyst. But How do you think that plays into this? Sarkisian's offensive mind, knowing maybe philosophically what Saban wants to do defensively.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's the game within the game that I think is so fascinating. And I can think back to the first time that Lane Kiffin played Nick Saban when he was at Ole Miss and versus Alabama. And afterwards, Lane told Nick, like, everything that you told me that you hated defending, I tried to do. So there's that, you've been around. And so Sark knows what Saban thinks is tough to deal with. And on the flip side, like Saban knows what Sark might struggle with, or certain looks that make it harder for the offense to do what he wants to do. So I think you have two of the premier minds, and obviously Saban's more accomplished than Sark, but in my opinion, Sark is the best offensive coordinator Saban's had during his run, even better than Kiffin. So I think there's a real respect there. They know each other well. They know things that they like to do. And so it's like a chess match. It's I think you're going to do this, so I'm going to do this instead. But then I think that you think I'm going to do this. There's all that trying to figure out, with the tendencies and things that they're going to do. So that to me is exciting. And, you've got some new guys on the Alabama side. Kevin Steele has been around forever. There's no major changes there, and it's Saban's, defense anyway. But Tommy Rees is an interesting factor, and I think it'll be, for Texas, create, maybe some unique challenges there, even though there's plenty of tape you can watch from Notre Dame days that you're getting a different look than I think what you had previously under Sark and Lane and Mike Loxley and some of the other offensive coordinators they've had.
Yeah, and you mentioned Sark maybe being the best offensive coordinator that Saban's had. Elaborate on that, because obviously he had some amazing skill talent. Najee Harris and all the 4 first-round receivers. But talk about that. What stood out about Sarkisian?
Yeah, I mean, he did a great job, and I wrote about this in my Saban book. But when he after that 20, or kind of toward the end of that 2020 season, there was a lot of interest in him, including Auburn wanting to interview him. And, they were going to bump him up pretty good salary wise. And it was also what I was told kind of intimated to him that, if you were willing to stick around for a bit, like you could be the guy to replace Saban down the line. And of course, ultimately he gets the Texas job and you can't turn that down, but he was well liked enough in that building with certain higher enough people that there was a potential path there for him to be the Alabama head coach down the line. So to me, that speaks to how well he was regarded. His past is well known. He came into Alabama initially as an analyst at a low point. I think there was a mutual respect from him and Saban, for Saban giving him another shot, for Sark, all the work that he put in. But he was able to, I think he had the best blend of elite X's and O's, elite play caller, but also very good just as, player development and just as a coach behind the scenes. Kiffin is maybe the best pure play caller that I've seen at Alabama, but I mean, he would probably admit it to you himself that he wasn't always the greatest coach. He wasn't always interested maybe in developing some of those, personal relationships, some of that day-to-day stuff. He wanted to just almost like Madden, just come up with great plays every day, right? And I think Sark had that same level of elite play calling, but had the other stuff too, which I think makes him a really good coach. And I mean, that 2020 team, it's I don't know how it's going to be remembered in history because of COVID and it was so weird, but I mean, that team was just absolutely dominant, and especially on offense, with all the guys, Devonta, Mac Jones, Najee. I mean, they had a lot of talent, but Sark also got the absolute most out of it.
So, Sarkisian has said that Saban saved his career by offering him that analyst position when no one else was calling after Sarkisian got fired in 2015 at USC. And then Sarkisian ends up kind of, I think Saban was okay with him taking Kyle Flood, and, AJ Milwee was already leaving. So that was no big deal. And we'd heard that maybe he would try and bring Pete Golding too, but that when he took Jeff Banks, Saban was like, okay, that's enough. What was your sense of how that played out?
Yeah, I think you nailed it right there. And it's funny, I can't remember if it was before or after this happened, but there was this great Saban and Belichick HBO like documentary, and he basically talks about that where he's like, you help these guys get jobs elsewhere and you're happy for them, but then they try to take all your best people. And like, it's kind of like, it's a double whammy where like, I helped put you in a position to get a Texas job. And then because you know how we do things here internally and you know who I value, you're trying to take a bunch of those guys on the way out with you. And Kirby did the same thing at Georgia. Their defensive coordinator now, Glenn Schumann, was a guy very highly regarded at Alabama, and he took him with him. He took Mel Tucker with him, and so it's definitely something that frustrates Saban because it's one of the underrated things I think about Saban's brilliance is just how often he has to replenish the ranks when his staffs get rated. And when you talk to people around him, it's gotten harder and harder for him because of guys like Sark and Kirby and Kiffin, that they're all hiring the same guys that he wants to hire. And so his circle has kind of gotten smaller because a lot of the guys he would think to hire are getting hired elsewhere. So I think Kyle Flood and Sark are very close. I think he got that one. As you pointed out, AJ Milway was initially going to Arkansas State with Butch Jones, which I'm sure he's very happy that he did not take that job. I think he's in a much better position at Texas. But I do think Jeff Banks bothered Saban. That was the word at the time where he's just like, come on, man. Like, you're taking another one of my guys. And I don't know if you might know this better than I do, Chip. I don't know if Sark and Banks even knew each other ahead of time. But that's also, I think, what bothers him, where it's just like, you guys met each other on my staff and now you're taking them too, where it's like, I think that is upsetting to him as well. But yeah, plenty of Texas guys who have Alabama roots, and it'll be an interesting game.
It is phenomenal how Saban has to constantly replace coordinators. I mean, people forget Brian Daboll was at Alabama with Saban, and there's Brian Daboll leading the Giants, to a playoff victory last year in the NFL. It's been phenomenal. And we probably need to plug your Saban book. So let's make sure we do that. Tell the folks where they can read your book.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't here to plug, but I thought it was relevant at the time. But yeah, it's called The Leadership Secrets of Nick Saban, How Alabama's Coach Became the Greatest Ever. You can buy it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy books. But it's basically a look at kind of that, like how Saban's been able to not only build but maintain this incredible organization at Alabama, and how some of that stuff is translatable to outside football. So there's a lot of cool football stories. There's Sark stories, Kiffin, other guys like that, but there's also stuff in there if you're a business owner or a manager of a company, whatever, that there's things that you can take from how Saban lives his day-to-day that could be applicable in your lifestyle as well.
Well, we'll wind it down, but I know it's important for Texas fans, a couple things for them to keep an eye on as they head to Tuscaloosa. First, players. I mean, I think we know Jalen Miller and we mentioned the running backs, but if Alabama's going to win this game and have the kind of season they want to have, who are the players who have to deliver for the Tide?
Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned the receivers earlier. Isaiah Bond had a great game against Middle Tennessee State. He looked, as good of any of the wide receivers they had. They need someone to step up. They spread the ball around a lot against Middle Tennessee State. I think we're going to see a lot of receiver by committee approach, but they need guys to be able to make plays. So whether that's Isaiah Bond, Jermaine Burton, Malik Benson, Ja'Cory Brooks was a guy who was one of the better wide receivers last year, and he was suspended for the first half against Middle Tennessee State, and Saban got mad even getting asked why he was suspended. So who knows what he did to put himself in the doghouse. But that's a big one. And then I'll go back to what I was saying earlier, like keep an eye out, Malachi Moore, Jalen Key, two guys who are banged up. Again, I think there'll probably be an update from Saban on Monday about where those guys stand, but they both looked very good against Middle Tennessee State, and I felt like there was a noticeable drop-off when those guys were out compared to the replacements. So if Earl Little has to play in place of Malachi Moore at the star position, I could see Sark just really attacking him and picking him apart. So that's another big one for me. And then just what we said earlier, can the offensive line actually deliver? There's so much talent, but can they actually push Texas around? I'm a little skeptical after what we saw against Middle Tennessee State, but certainly the talent's there. They've got plenty of big boys who can throw some weight around.
Yeah, this could be a real defensive battle. Maybe take the under. Okay, before I get your prediction for the game, for fans, Texas fans heading to Tuscaloosa, where's the must-go place so that they can tell all their friends, yeah, we went to Alabama and we went to...
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple of quick rundowns here, and I'll give you Tuscaloosa options and some Birmingham options in case people are flying into Birmingham and staying there. So in Tuscaloosa, Archibald's is the famous rib place. It's a hole in the wall. Make sure you go to the one that seems the most remote. That's the one you want to go to. It's one of those places where if you don't get there early enough, they run out of ribs and they're just done for the day. It's Andy Staples loves it. It's a great place to go to. It's worth going to. The other place that I love, I think the best burger in Tuscaloosa is this place, Avenue Pub. It's, I think, very, very good. I mean, just great food in general. Pretty easy to get to. I think that's a good option. And then, bars, there's a lot in the Strip people can go to. Galette's is one of the famous ones. Rounders, the Houndstooth. There's a couple of different options there. And then if you go to Birmingham, I'll plug my favorite restaurant in Birmingham. If you like Italian, there's a place called John Marco's. That's just great Italian food that people will definitely enjoy. And there's plenty of good barbecue places in Birmingham too. There's a kind of a little mini chain just in Birmingham called Saws. There's, I think, 4 or 5 of them at this point, but they're all great. So if you're looking for some Birmingham barbecue, Saws is a good spot.
Nice. All right, John. How do you see this one playing out?
So in my preseason predictions, picked Alabama to win. I still think that they do. I think it's extremely close. I just give we hit on it earlier, the 21-game streak. I'm just kind of giving Alabama the benefit of the doubt at home. I think, excuse me, I think they lose to one of the 2 Texas schools. I kind of leaned, they beat Texas. They lose to A&M because A&M's on the road. But I think it's going to be extremely close. It's a statement game for both of these teams. I really think that. I think if Texas wins, Texas is back. Talk will be everywhere. If Alabama wins, I think it's the momentum they need to start rolling into the SEC season. So I'm just excited for it. It's a game that I've been looking forward to for a while now, and I'm sure Texas fans have too. There's that what if, man, if he just hadn't gotten hurt, we could have beaten them and all that. So I'm sure they're ready to see, what a healthy Quinn can do.
Yeah. Is there anything else you think is significant to this game? Any storylines?
No, I think we hit on the majority of them. I mean, I think if you want to go super, super big picture, hot takey, it's if either one of these guys loses this game and it starts a trend, what does that mean big picture? If Sark loses 3-4 games this year, if Saban loses 3-4 games this year, what does that mean? That to me, but that's so far down the line to figure out what it means. But I just think it's just in Alabama, they're still all in on Saban. Don't get me wrong here, but missing the playoffs, like there's going to be that little bit of if they can't make the playoff this year is Saban getting too old, all that kind of stuff. And so I could just see the early whispers of that narrative happening if Alabama loses this game.
Yeah, it's amazing because what he's done. I mean, he's the best. He's, as you said, he's the GOAT. No doubt about it. I mean, who'd have thunk it that he could replace the Bear, exceed the Bears' accomplishments, right?
Right. And it's funny. I'm just thinking about it now. We didn't even talk about, Saban's flirtation with Texas, years ago. And so that's just kind of another little factor there of, there's that whole different sliding doors moment of Saban leaves Alabama for Texas. And I know that story better than anybody, but that's just kind of another little interesting wrinkle of, man, we maybe could have had this guy for the last decade. Instead, he's just beating the world down and winning all those national championships in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Do you address that in your book?
Briefly, I feel like it's been, I think it's been talked about enough that like I didn't know that there was that much more new that I was going to get from that situation. The thing that I had in my book that I don't think anybody had written about at the time was that around that same time of all the Texas flirtation, he was also talking to ESPN about a possible college game day role and thinking about basically, I think he was at that point in his life where if it's not Alabama, where do I want to be, right? And so he thought about Texas and all the Jimmy Sexton stuff. And then I think, I write about this scene in which he's at the national championship game and he's meeting with higher ups at ESPN talking about what it would look like if he retired and went to ESPN. And ultimately, of course, he doesn't go to Texas. He doesn't go to ESPN. He's still at Alabama. He's still winning. But that was a real, I think, interesting moment for him where I think he was not feeling the gratitude in Alabama. I think he was feeling the pressure of having to win a national championship every single year unless people freaked out. And I think he was just wondering if that's the life he wanted to continue living. And ultimately he did. And it's hard to argue that he made a wrong decision. It's worked out pretty well for him.
Okay, real quick, Miss Terry. What is her role? How visible is she around the program? Is she involved in recruiting these kids as a mother figure? How would you describe that?
Oh yeah, I mean, you could say she's like the COO of if he's the CEO, she's the chief operating officer. I mean, she's very heavily involved. I've been told that like she, whether she insists on it or just the way it works, like she's CC'd on most emails that he's getting, like she's kind of making decisions for him in terms of how he's branded and business deals and things like that outside of football. And so she's been a major reason for her success. I think a lot of college coaches would tell you that if you don't have the right partner, you're not able to devote the insane hours that you need to be successful at this level. But I think one of the big reasons why Nick Saban is still at Alabama is Miss Terry. From everything that I've been told, she didn't love the NFL lifestyle. I think that's in part because people don't really care about who the head coach's wife is in the NFL, but in the college level, you can kind of be the queen bee of the city. And I think that's who she is. She's, involved in a bunch of charities. She's very visible on game days. You'll see this chip on Saturday. She's usually in Nick's press conference after games, and she'll be kind of, clapping and yesing and knowing when he's saying certain things. And so she's all in. I mean, she's a huge part of what he does with Alabama football.
And last thing, John, Texas headed to the SEC next year. A&M hit the SEC with Johnny Manziel. The Netflix documentary reminded everyone that, their first year in the SEC, he goes bananas, wins the Heisman. A&M fans are going bonkers. And then they sort of, settled into middle of the pack status, which is easy to do. Missouri won 2 SEC East titles under Gary Pinkel, slid into probably middle to lower pack status. You describe it. What's Texas? What are Texas and Oklahoma in for? And, how critical, having your leadership, coaching, everything buttoned up.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I always come back to and how I explain it is, in order for someone to move up, someone has to move down. And I think that's the challenge of the SEC is that it's not like, especially at the upper end, it's not like any of those programs aren't doing everything they can to win and aren't investing at the highest level. So the Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, even if sometimes they're down, they're trying to put everything possible to power up. I mean, even a school like Arkansas, which we consider probably to be toward the bottom end of the SEC, they're still investing an insane amount of money to try to be good. So it's very competitive. It's more schools. I mean, Texas is as rich as it gets, but there are more schools, I think, at that Texas level where maybe they could kind of money whip people in the Big 12 a little easier than I think they can in the SEC. So I think everyone's excited to see what Texas can do. Personally, I think Texas is better set up for an SEC transition than Oklahoma is. I would be a little concerned as an Oklahoma fan about how that's all going to translate over. But just from the way that it seems like Texas is recruiting at an extremely high level, the talent they already have in place, I think they're going to be able to be competitive. But, Texas, better than anybody, Chip. Texas has had every advantage for a long time, and the results haven't been there. So and they're walking into a harder path. So I don't know. I mean, you would think that they should be better just based on all the investment they have, but it's a hard path, and it's just a battle every week. I mean, that's really what it is. It's a battle every week. I didn't even mention LSU. I mean, LSU, every coach wins a national championship if you're LSU. I mean, that's what you got to beat up every year, and it's just a hard path.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. You have to have the leadership buttoned up. You got to have the coach. You got to have the recruiting, because the negative recruiting is fierce, and everybody's, I think Texas just saw it. They were trying to reel in this kid, Dominic McKinley from Louisiana. Maybe they were the leader. Then all of a sudden it's, A&M, Oklahoma, LSU, and he picks A&M. Now, signing day, whatever, but is still a ways away. And as Sark likes to say, sometimes it gets harder, once they commit to you, because then the schools know exactly who they're negative recruiting against. But it's a cage match every week in the SEC. It's going to be exciting. And this Saturday is going to be exciting. Thanks so much, John, for your time. I know the folks listening in and watching in on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel sure do appreciate it. Take care, and we'll see you Saturday.
Can't wait.
All right, there he is. John Talty, Bama247.com. For John, I am Chip Brown. Until next time, we'll see you over at Horns247.com. Stay safe and keep the faith.